afternoon and welcome to From Where We Are, stories of news and culture through the lens of USC and Southern California. I'm Jameela Hammond, coming to you live from Studio B in USC's Annenberg Media Center.
And I'm Colby Martin. It's Thursday, the last day of March 31st, 2022. On today's show,
President Biden's plan for gas price relief.
And the bottom line is, if we want lower gas prices, we need to have a more oil supply right now.
Celebrating International Transgender Day of Visibility.
And an understanding of cisheteropatriarchy.
All that and more, but first, these news headlines.
From Annenberg Media, I'm Ann Chen. President Biden announced today that the U.S. will release up to 180 million barrels of oil to reduce high energy prices. Gasoline prices have risen nearly $1.5 a gallon over the last year. Biden plans to release 1 million barrels of oil a day for 180 days. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, Russian troops have given Ukraine the Chernobyl nuclear power plant after taking control for more than 1 month. They returned control to the Ukrainians in writing. The IAEA also said Russian troops moved a convoy away from a nearby city in which many nuclear plant staff live. Instead, they are moving this convoy in addition to 2 others toward Belarus. Senate Democrats and Republicans almost reached an agreement regarding a coronavirus response package. The parties agreed to reduce the package to $10 billion from $15.6 billion. President Biden requested the money for vaccines, therapeutics, and preparation against future variants. The 2 parties have yet to agree on which programs should be tapped with the unspent money and new package. The January to March period, which ended today for the stock market, was a rough quarter. In fact, the market is experiencing the worst quarterly performance for all 3 major indexes since the start of the pandemic. Federal Reserve monetary tightening and the Russian invasion in Ukraine are the leading causes for this quarterly loss. All 3 major indexes dropped over 1.5% to close the quarter. Severe storms hit the Deep South overnight, killing at least 2 people in the Florida Panhandle. 2 conformed tornadoes also ripped across Mississippi and Tennessee, causing injuries and damaged buildings. 185,000 people were left without electricity today across the Midwest and South. Next week, it'll be a lot easier to get on campus. Trojan checks will no longer be needed starting April 4th. Senior Vice President David Wright wrote to students earlier today, announcing these new changes as COVID-19 cases remain low in LA County. He also says students, faculty, and staff should still monitor the symptoms daily and test as needed. Those are some of today's news headlines.
President Biden announced that the U.S. will tap into the strategic petroleum reserves to help ease the pain of record-high gas prices. Eli Maskett has the story.
This move comes several weeks after the U.S. announced strict sanctions against Russia, causing already rising oil prices to go up even more. Americans have felt the brunt of this. We're paying more than $1 extra per gallon of gas. For President Biden, the immediate solution is straightforward. Increase the oil supply.
Our prices are rising because of Putin's action. There isn't enough supply. And the bottom line is, if we want lower gas prices, we need to have a more oil supply right now.
The nation's Strategic Petroleum Reserve will release 1 million barrels a day for the next 6 months. That will amount to over 180 million barrels, which is about a third of the entire U.S. reserve. This is the largest release of oil from the reserve in its history. The oil is stored in underground salt caverns in the southern U.S. Jonathan Aronson is a USC professor of international relations. He says the move by the White House won't do enough to lower gas prices.
It's not going to change everything immediately. What's also happening is that the gasoline companies, the oil companies, when things get tight, they tend to raise prices more quickly, and they don't lower it as fast on the far end. So yes, it will have a little bit of difference, but you're still going to be paying a lot more than you would have otherwise.
Oil represents a major U.S. vulnerability. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, domestic production only accounts for a little more than half of the 21 million barrels used by Americans daily. Administration officials estimate that domestic production will increase by 1 million barrels daily by the end of 2022. But there is a long way to go before the nation doesn't need to rely on foreign oil. The president also wants Congress to impose financial penalties on oil companies that choose not to produce oil on public land. Biden shamed oil producers for focusing more on making money than on what's doing best for the American people during the Ukraine crisis.
This is the time, not the time to sit on record profits. It's time to step up for the good of your country.
USC professor Jonathan Aronson says that the gas crisis may push the country more towards clean energy.
This makes other kinds of fuels much more attractive. Certainly, a lot of people who can afford it, when they buy their next car, they're going to look much more carefully at electric vehicles than they would have otherwise.
For Annenberg Media, I'm Eli Maskett.
Today is International Transgender Day of Visibility. This was first marked last year by President Biden. As Fanny Zhang reports, International Transgender Day of Visibility aims to celebrate the achievements in transgender rights and to increase awareness of ongoing challenges transgender and gender non-conforming people face.
The Biden administration marked the International Transgender Day of Visibility today with a series of measures to support transgender Americans, even as they face a slew of laws and efforts across the country to curtail their rights. The administration announced actions to support the mental health of transgender children and to remove barriers to entry for government services in the U.S. for trans people and to improve their representation in government and other data. Biden said in a presidential proclamation yesterday, "Transgender people are some of the bravest Americans I know, and our nation and the world are stronger, more vibrant, and more prosperous because of them." Biden posted on Twitter video today.
Our entire administration sees you for who you are, made in the image of God and deserving of dignity, respect, and support.
The administration announced today an option for U.S. citizens to select X as their gender on U.S. passport applications. The administration is also expected to work with airlines, the Transportation Security Administration, and the Department of Homeland Security to add X gender markers to their options and databases. Starting this year, the Social Security Administration and other government agencies, including Equal Employment Opportunity and Federal Student Aid, will remove the requirement that transgender people show proof of identity or a note from a doctor to update their gender information. And the Department of Health and Human Services, Education, and Mental Health will release new ways to address challenges transgender youth may face. Olivia Hunt is a policy director of the National Center for Transgender Equality.
Transgender Americans deserve to live their lives to their fullest as part of their communities. And having accurate identification documents that reflect who they are and how they live their lives helps them secure that place so they can be fully themselves with their families, their workplaces, their schools, their entire community.
In his proclamation, President Biden addressed the background for today's actions. In the past year, hundreds of anti-transgender bills in states were proposed across America, most of them targeting transgender kids.
The onslaught of anti-transgender state laws attacking you and your families is simply wrong. This administration is standing up for you against all these hateful bills, and we're committed to advancing transgender equality in the classroom, on the playing field, at work, in our military, in our housing and healthcare systems, everywhere, simply everywhere.
Again, Olivia Hunt of the National Center for Transgender Equality.
So the new policies that were announced today are things that advocates for trans people and for non-binary people's rights have been working for decades at this point. But they're only a few victories, and there are a lot of battles that still need to be fought at both the federal and the state level.
And today, the Department of Health and Human Services will fly a transgender pride flag to mark the day, the first time in history a federal agency will do so. For Annenberg Media, I'm Fanny Zhang.
I'm Colby Martin.
And I'm Jameela Hammond. It's 10 minutes past the hour. We're glad you're with us for From Where We Are.
Jameela, do you hear that?
I do.
That music means it's time for Root Source.
Ooh, it is. We just heard that today is International Transgender Day of Visibility. And because it's the last day of March, it's also the last day of Women's Month. Yes, you heard me right. It is the last day.
Woo!
Did you?
Sorry, that was sad.
Did you know, though, for everyone listening, did you know there's a word that neatly encapsulates the issues faced by these communities? Here's Mindy Kong with this week's root source on cisheteropatriarchy.
You've probably heard about the patriarchy, but what about the cisheteropatriarchy? It looks like a mouthful, but let's break it down. Biologist Dr. Sheth McLean writes that patriarchy is a social system in which men are the primary authority figures over women and children. It entails female subordination. This looks like how women were historically unable to own property or provide for themselves without a man. We have most likely heard about this definition, but it's actually missing something. Cisheteropatriarchy builds off of patriarchy to acknowledge the colonial construct of there being only two genders and to include LGBTQ people. Gender is a construct, but it's specifically a colonial construct. Let's get a closer look. The first part of the word is cis, which is short for cisgender. This is a term that means your gender matches what was assigned for you at birth, which was likely based on your sex. However, sex and gender are different. They do not always align, and there are not only two, as Dr. McLean explains.
And it's important to note that genitalia and sex chromosomes don't necessarily agree with one another. Placement in a sex category is achieved through socially required displays that proclaim one's membership. And those socially required displays, that's gender.
Dr. McLean also writes the concept of gender only being binary is European. In pre-colonial African societies, gender was not in a binary or the basis for the way society organized power. The false binary of male and female has greatly and intentionally harmed people who do not fit, who are trans, non-binary, and/or intersex. This brings us to heteropatriarchy. The Anti-Violence Project defines heteropatriarchy as a colonial concept that defines masculinity and femininity in narrow ways, in order to establish males as opposite and superior to females, and those who they don't see as true men. This is the case because heteropatriarchy also serves to naturalize all other hierarchies, such as white supremacy and settler colonialism. As Anti-Violence Project explains, when colonists first came to this land, they instilled patriarchy in native communities because they realized that indigenous peoples would not accept colonial domination if their own indigenous societies were not structured on the basis of social hierarchy. Reed Gustafson, a Laguna Pueblo member and indigenous studies scholar, also explains this.
Settler colonial assimilation processes look to impose heteronormative Christian monogamy on indigenous communities in the hopes to change sexual practices, familial structures, gender norms, and power dynamics within these communities. Ultimately, the goal, though, was to assimilate indigenous peoples and erase them in order to complete the settler colonial project.
Patriarchy was a starting point, but cis-heteropatriarchy brings out the ways gender itself is performed differently across the intersections of sexuality, class, and race. That is where we can begin to understand what violence exists in our world. To put it all together, cis-heteropatriarchy is a system of power and control that positions cis-straight, white males as superior and normative in their expression of gender and sexuality. This is important to understand the way different communities, specifically LGBTQ and people of color, face harm today. The late activist Bell Hooks also did this, but instead with the term imperialist white supremacist heteropatriarchy in her work on cultural criticism and transformation. For Women's Month, when thinking about patriarchy, also consider cis-heteropatriarchy and what it can mean for those in our communities day to day. For Annenberg Media, I'm Mindy Kong.
USC custodial staff demonstrated a public protest on campus March 30th, demanding higher wages and benefits from their employer, Aramark. Workers were joined by students as well as LA mayoral candidate Kevin De Leon as the protests traveled throughout campus over to the village. With us now is Tony Fajardo, a writer at the Daily Trojan who was one of the first to cover their story. Tony, thank you so much for coming in today.
Obviously, it's thankful to be here. Thank you for asking for this interview. Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you so much again for taking the time to join us. The USC custodial staff was laid off about 26 years ago before being picked up by Aramark, which allowed them to stay on campus as workers, but also resulted in a loss of benefits. Why do you think USC hasn't hired them since they have the means to, and rather than subcontract other organizations to do the same?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question that I obviously had in mind throughout the rest of the protest. I think it's probably a logistical thing where a lot of these employees, they mention that they go by a contract basis, and that's how it's been for the past 26 years. A lot of them had been at USC prior to joining the union and prior to being part of Aramark. So it was a very interesting subject for them, a very pressing subject for them, because obviously they feel as if this is a routine cycle for them. They're always fighting for their benefits, always fighting to renegotiate. But I believe possibly for USC it's a logistical thing. Obviously there's less things they would have to wear on their end, and obviously more things that they would have to put on Aramark that they would handle that USC doesn't need to handle anymore.
Speaking of logistics, surprisingly, this same incident actually occurred 4 years ago in 2018, where workers had to protest for higher wages. What do you think it will have to take for these protests to finally end altogether and ensure that the workers are fairly compensated?
Yeah, like I mentioned, a lot of the workers had talked about how this is somewhat of a routine cycle for them. That's one of the workers I talked to describe it that way, as a routine cycle. And specifically for this one, they were specifically outraged due to the fact that it was only that at the current time when I spoke to them, the negotiations had only reached a 30-cent increase to their wages. And they obviously didn't enjoy that, especially coming out of a pandemic where these are essential workers and they did put their lives on the line of them and their families. So I think on that end, they would have to obviously increase their wages to a point where they feel it keeps up with the inflation. As we see nowadays, there's a lot of prices are going up in almost every sector. And I talked to the union president, and he described it that way, that they would want affordable health care benefits and higher wages that would keep up with the inflation rates in California. So I think that's something that would need to obviously be on the table for them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. Tony Fajardo is a freshman studying journalism who writes for the Daily Trojan. To stay informed on the custodial protests, check in regularly for updates at both the Daily Trojan and USC Annenberg Media. Thank you again so much, Tony. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And that's all we have time for on today's From Where We Are. Yuki, Liang, Aarohi, Sheth, and Fernando Cienfuegos produced today's show. Fernando Cienfuegos runs our soundboard.
And we had help from Coco Shinshi Wong, Grace Harrington, Joey Elbaum, Will Simmons, Veronica Sierra Leone, Kari Spencer, Sam Tarlov, and Ivana Betty. Derek Runfro composed our theme music.
This is Trojan Check. We're maskless.
We are.
This is Trojan Check is the next thing, right, to go, hopefully?
Well, I'm hoping also it's Duolingo or Duo Mobile, whatever you call it, because I can't deal with this anymore. Come on.
Well, listen, make sure that we stream live on KXSC. Follow us at kxsc.org/listen, as well as on YouTube. Make sure to check us out at Annenberg Radio News on YouTube.
Subscribe to From Where We Are on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And look for us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Annenberg Media. I'm Colby Martin.
And I'm Jameela Hammond. From all of us at Annenberg Radio, wherever you are, we hope you'll join us again, for
From Where We Are.